The glass walls of the Juno Tower were so clear they seemed invisible, but to Kesha, they were a cage of light that reminded her exactly where she stood, at the very bottom. She gripped the plastic handle of her industrial mop until her knuckles turned white, her neon yellow safety vest feeling like a target on her back in a room full of silk and tailored wool. It was only her second shift on the floor, and the filtered climate-controlled air of the lobby felt thinner and more suffocating than the humid city streets she had left behind. The tower was a fortress of predatory efficiency, a place where the marble floors were polished to such a high gloss they reflected the cold, hurried faces of men who earned more in a minute than Kesha would see in a year. Kesha needed this job with a desperation that tasted like copper. Her grandmother's medical bills were piling up on the kitchen counter back home, a paper monument to their poverty that grew taller with every passing day. She kept her eyes glued to the floor, buffing away ghost-like footprints that weren't even there, trying to shrink into the shadows of the pillars. Standing near the high-speed elevators was the building manager, Preston. He was a tall, skeletal man whose charcoal suit cost more than Kesha's entire life's earnings. He moved through the lobby like a shark in a glass tank, his eyes like polished flint, scanning for any speck of dust or any person who didn't look like they belonged in a temple of billion-dollar deals. To Preston, the staff weren't people. They were biological machinery that needed to be silent, efficient, and, above all, invisible. The glass walls of the Juno Tower were so clear they seemed invisible, but to Kesha, they were a cage of light that reminded her exactly where she stood, at the very bottom. She gripped the plastic handle of her industrial mop until her knuckles turned white, the neon yellow safety vest feeling like a target on her back in a room full of silk and tailored wool. It was only her second shift on the floor, and the filtered climate-controlled air of the lobby felt thinner and more suffocating than the humid city streets she had left behind. Every few minutes, the high-speed elevators chimed, a sound like a silver bell that announced the arrival of another predator. Kesha kept her head down. Her focus narrowed to the 3-foot radius of marble directly in front of her. She had become an expert at reading the world through shoes. The aggressive click of Italian leather loafers, the sharp snap of designer stilettos, and the heavy, silent tread of security boots. To these people, she was merely part of the architecture, a biological extension of the cleaning supplies she carried. The tower was a fortress of predatory efficiency, a place where the floor was polished to such a high gloss that it reflected the cold, hurried faces of men who earned more in a minute than Kesha would see in a year. She needed this job with a desperation that tasted like copper. Back in her cramped apartment, her grandmother's medical bills were piling up on the kitchen counter, a paper monument to their poverty that grew taller with every passing day. Every bill was a noose, and the Juno Tower was the only thing keeping the chair from being kicked out from under her. "Move it, 402. You're dragging the pace." The voice was like a whip crack. Kesha didn't need to look up to know it was Preston. He didn't use names. He used the numbers printed on their employee badges. He was a tall, skeletal man whose charcoal suit cost more than Kesha's entire life's earnings. He moved through the lobby like a shark in a glass tank, his eyes like polished flint, scanning for any speck of dust or any person who didn't look like they belonged in a temple of billion-dollar deals. Preston stopped just inches from Kesha's mop. She could smell his expensive cologne, something sharp and cold like mountain air and ozone. "There is a smudge on the north-facing glass," he whispered, his voice carrying a jagged edge of threat. 3 minutes. If I can still see it by the time the board members arrive, you can go back to whatever gutter you crawled out of. Am I clear? "Yes, sir," Kesha murmured, her voice barely audible. She didn't look him in the eye. To look at Preston was to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny in this building led to termination. She moved toward the glass, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The lobby was a theater of status, and she was the stagehand tasked with making sure the set remained flawless for the actors. She sprayed the glass, the fine mist briefly obscuring the view of the city outside before she wiped it away with frantic, rhythmic strokes. She had to remain a shadow. She had to be the ghost that kept the fortress shining. As she worked, she felt the stifling weight of the tower's collective indifference. Hundreds of people passed her, their conversations about mergers and acquisitions flowing over her like water over a stone. She was a ghost in a neon vest, a girl cleaning the tracks of an empire that didn't know she existed. But as she polished the glass until it vanished once more, she caught her own reflection. For a fleeting second, the fear in her eyes was replaced by a spark of something else, a quiet, burning resilience. She was a shadow for now, but even shadows have a way of lengthening when the light begins to shift. The rhythmic friction of the microfiber cloth against the glass was the only thing keeping Kesha grounded. She stayed in her designated zone, a ghost in a neon vest, watching the world through the transparent barrier she worked so hard to make vanish. The afternoon rush had begun, and the lobby of Juno Tower was a sea of moving shadows, dark suits, clicking heels, and the scent of expensive cigars. Then the heavy revolving doors pushed open, and the rhythm of the room stuttered. An elderly man stepped into the vast, marble expanse. He was a stark contrast to the predatory elegance of the building. His suit was gray, worn at the elbows and ill-fitting, as if it belonged to a version of him from 20 years ago. He moved with a slight limp, his eyes wide and blinking against the clinical brightness of the glass walls. He looked less like a corporate titan and more like a leaf caught in a high-velocity wind. Kesha watched him from her corner. To the executives rushing past, he was an obstacle, a smudge on the pristine perfection of their day. They swerved around him without a glance, their faces tightening with a collective irritation. The man approached the main concierge desk, his hands trembling slightly as he reached into his pocket. He began to speak, his voice thin but carrying a strange rhythmic lilt. It wasn't the sharp, modern Korean spoken by the young tech moguls on their headsets. It was deeper, filled with archaic honorifics and a regional cadence that sounded like the earth itself. It was the language of an older world, one of fields and villages, not of glass and steel. Manager Preston was there in an instant. He didn't walk. He glided, his presence casting a long skeletal shadow over the desk. He didn't greet the man. He simply stood there, his mouth pursed as if he had detected a foul odor in his temple of wealth. "I cannot understand a word you are saying," Preston said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of a nearby group of executives. "This is a place of business, not a charity ward. If you are lost, the bus stop is 3 blocks east." The elderly man leaned in, his expression one of desperate hope. He spoke again, more urgently this time, holding out a small, weathered leather book. He used a specific honorific, a title reserved for the head of a household, a word so old it sounded foreign even to the Korean-American interns nearby. The group of young executives began to snicker. "Is he speaking in riddles?" One of them laughed, adjusting his gold watch. "Someone call security. He's polluting the acoustic profile of the lobby." Preston's eyes turned to flint. "It's offensive," he hissed, his gaze raking over the man's dusty shoes. "To walk in here looking like that and babbling nonsense at my desk. You are a distraction to our clients." Kesha felt a cold shiver run down her spine. From her grandmother's house, she had learned the sound of that dialect. It was the language of the elders, the foundation upon which empires were built before the sons forgot the cost of the bricks. She saw the man's shoulders slump under the weight of their mockery. He wasn't a vagrant. He was a man who had traveled a great distance only to find that his son's world had grown too tall to see him. "Security!" Preston barked, snapping his fingers. "Escort this vagrant out. And make sure he doesn't leave any more scuff marks on my marble." Kesha's hand tightened on her mop handle. The noose of her debt felt tighter than ever, a physical reminder that she should stay silent, stay invisible, and stay a shadow. But as she watched the security guards close in on the frail man in the gray suit, the silence of the fortress felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. The old man looked around, lost in a forest of glass, and for the first time, Kesha stopped polishing. She didn't look at the floor. She looked at the man. The air in the lobby seemed to thicken, turning stagnant as the circle of executives tightened around the elderly man. Kesha watched from the periphery, her mop held like a useless scepter. The silence of the tower was gone, replaced by the sharp, cruel laughter of men who had never known a day of hunger. At the center of the throng, a young executive named Marcus, a man whose face was a mask of groomed arrogance, stepped forward, swirling a porcelain cup of steaming oolong tea. "You're in the wrong zip code, old-timer," Marcus drawled, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He looked at his colleagues, seeking the approval of their smirk. "We don't sell antique suits here, and we certainly don't have time for whatever rural dialect you're barking. This is a place for the future. You look like you're still waiting for the invention of the wheel." The old man didn't flinch at the words, though he clearly understood the tone. He held out his weathered leather book again, his voice trembling as he tried once more to bridge the gap. He spoke a single word, a name, followed by a plea for an audience. But Marcus wasn't listening. With a flick of his wrist, he tilted his cup. The tea cascaded through the air in a slow-motion arc of amber, splashing across the old man's worn gray trousers and pooling onto the pristine marble floor that Kesha had just polished. The executives erupted in a fresh wave of snickering. "Oops," Marcus mocked, showing his teeth in a predatory smile. "Looks like you've made a mess. And in this building we don't like messes." The elderly man looked down at the tea soaking into his threadbare wool, his expression shifting from hope to a profound, quiet shame. It was the look of a man who had built a world only to be told he wasn't allowed to stand in it. He began to reach for a handkerchief, but Preston intervened before he could even bend his knees. The manager glided forward, his face twisted in a look of clinical revulsion. He didn't look at the tea on the floor. He looked at the man as if he were the stain. "That is quite enough," Preston hissed. "You have insulted our guests, disrupted our operations, and now you've defiled the lobby." Preston turned to the two security guards standing by the elevators, broad-shouldered men with earpieces and eyes of stone. He pointed a long, skeletal finger at the revolving doors. "Dispose of this vagrant. If he resists, call the police and have him charged with trespassing and harassment. I want him out of my sight before the scent of the street settles into the upholstery." The guards moved in, their heavy boots thudding against the marble. One of them reached out, his hand larger than the old man's entire shoulder, intending to haul him toward the exit like a sack of refuse. The executive stepped back, giving the disposal a wide berth, their faces reflecting a terrifying mixture of boredom and amusement. Kesha felt the noose tighten. She looked at the tea puddle, the very mess she was paid to clean, and then at the man who was being discarded in a building that bore his son's name, though the fools in suits didn't know it yet. The invisible language she had learned from her neighbors was screaming in her ears, translating the old man's silence into a cry for justice. "Stay in the shadows," her fear whispered. "Think of the medical bills. Think of the grandmother waiting for her surgery." But as the guard's hand closed around the old man's arm, causing him to stumble, the cage of light that was the Juno Tower finally felt like it was breaking. Kesha didn't reach for her spray bottle. She didn't move to clean the tea. Instead, she took a step forward, the rubber soles of her work shoes squeaking loudly against the silence of the fortress. The shadow was finally moving, and for the first time in the Juno Tower, the help was about to be heard. The heavy thud of the security guard's boots against the marble seemed to vibrate through the very soles of Kesha's work shoes, pulling her out of the paralysis of fear. She watched as the guard's thick fingers tightened on the old man's sleeve, the fabric of the humble gray suit bunching and straining. The executives were already turning away, their laughter subsiding into the bored indifference of people who had finished watching a minor entertainment. Kesha didn't plan the moment she dropped the mop. It hit the floor with a wet, heavy slap that echoed like a gunshot through the vaulted lobby. "Stop!" The word left her throat before she could remind herself of the medical bills or the grandmother waiting for her at home. The silence that followed was absolute. Manager Preston froze, his head pivoting toward Kesha with the slow, mechanical grace of a predator that had just detected a disturbance in its territory. Marcus and the other executives paused, their expressions shifting from amusement to a dangerous, icy confusion. Kesha stepped over the puddle of tea, her neon yellow vest a defiant streak of light against the corporate grays. She ignored Preston's flint-like eyes and walked straight to the elderly man. As she drew closer, she saw the black smoke of humiliation clinging to him, a heavy, suffocating aura of shame that no one else in the room could see. But beneath that she heard it. The man was whispering, a soft, rhythmic string of words that the others had dismissed as babbling. To them it was nonsense. To Kesha, it was the invisible language. It was the archaic, formal dialect of the Gyeongsang province, filled with honorifics so deep and ancient they were practically sacred. He wasn't just asking for help. He was identifying himself as the Gaju, the patriarch. Kesha bowed. It wasn't the shallow, professional nod she had been trained to give guests. It was a deep, traditional bow from the waist, the kind that showed her neck, a sign of total and absolute respect. "Abyanim," she said, her voice clear and resonant, slicing through the stifling air of the lobby. She used the highest form of the word for father, a term reserved for the head of an elite bloodline. The security guard hesitated, his hand loosening on the old man's arm. The elderly man's eyes widened, his trembling hands going still. He looked at Kesha, and for the first time since he had entered the fortress of glass, he saw someone who wasn't looking through him. Kesha continued, speaking in the same rhythmic, lilting dialect. She apologized for the uneducated nature of the house and promised that the master of the tower would be notified of his arrival immediately. She spoke with a fluency that didn't come from a textbook, but from a life of listening to the elders who had been pushed into the shadows of the city. "What are you doing, 402? Preston's voice was a low, lethal hiss. He stepped toward her, his face contorted with rage. "You are overstepping. You are a cleaner. Get back to your station before I have you arrested along with this vagrant." Kesha stood up straight, her eyes meeting Preston's for the first time. The amber light of her resolve flickered in her pupils, an echo of the sight that allowed her to see the truth behind the silk suits. "This man is not a vagrant, Mr. Preston," Kesha said, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart. "And the dialect he is speaking isn't nonsense. It's the language of the man who built the foundation this tower stands on. If you throw him out, you aren't just discarding an old man. You are discarding the father of Lee Juno." The name hit the room like a physical blow. Marcus's smirk vanished, and the teacup in his hand trembled. Preston's face went from a pale gray to a sickly white as he looked from the cleaner in the neon vest to the frail man in the gray suit. The fortress of glass was still standing, but the first cracks had finally begun to spiderweb across the surface. The silence following Kesha's declaration was thick and suffocating, like the air before a lightning strike. Preston stood frozen, his face a grotesque mask of disbelief and escalating fury. The name of the man who owned the very air they breathed had been spoken by a woman who was supposed to be a shadow. For a heartbeat, the corporate predators wavered, their predatory smirks faltering as they looked from the cleaner in the neon vest to the frail, tea-soaked man in the gray suit. But the habit of cruelty was too deeply ingrained. Preston recovered first, a harsh, jagged laugh escaping his throat. "Lee Juno's father," he sneered, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and desperation. "You expect me to believe that a man of his stature would allow his father to walk the streets in rags? You've lost your mind, 402. You're not just a failure, you're a liability." He turned to the security guards, his skeletal finger stabbing the air. "I don't care what she says. Take them both. Drag her out by her hair if you have to, but get this filth out of my lobby." The guards, conditioned to obey the man in the expensive suit, stepped forward. Their heavy boots thudded against the marble, a rhythmic march of impending violence. Kesha felt the cold weight of the noose tighten around her neck. The image of her grandmother's unpaid bills flashed through her mind like a death sentence. To stay meant ruin. To fight meant the end of her life as she knew it. She didn't run. Instead, she lowered the handle of her industrial mop, bracing it horizontally between her and the advancing guards. It was a flimsy barrier of plastic and aluminum, a pathetic defense against men trained in combat, but it was the only line of protection the old man had. "Don't touch him," Kesha said, her voice dropping to a low, resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate through the floor. The lead guard reached out to shove the mop aside, but Kesha didn't budge. She planted her feet, the rubber soles of her work shoes gripping the wet marble with surprising strength. She was no longer just a cleaner. She was a guardian standing at the gates. The elderly man behind her reached out, his trembling hand resting lightly on the small of her back. He spoke a single word in that archaic, beautiful dialect, a word that meant peace, but his eyes remained fixed on the elevators. "This is your last warning, 402, Preston hissed, stepping closer. "Move, or I will make sure you never find work in this city again. I will crush you." "Then crush me," Kesha countered, her amber eyes igniting with a fire that made Preston flinch. "But as long as I'm standing here, you will not lay a hand on this man. He has more dignity in his stained sleeve than you have in your entire empire of glass." The guard lost his patience and lunged, his hand closing around the mop handle to wrench it from her grasp. Kesha held on, her muscles straining, the physical struggle drawing the eyes of every person in the lobby. Marcus and the other executives watched with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. The invisible girl had become a beacon of defiance, a spark of humanity in a fortress of stone. The struggle was brief but violent. The guard swung his arm, intending to knock Kesha to the ground, but she moved with a practiced weight distribution, the CNA training she had used to lift patients now serving as her anchor. She didn't fall. She stood her ground, the mop handle vibrating with the force of the conflict. The old man looked up, his face no longer showing shame, but a profound, sorrowful pride. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small leather book, holding it high. Just as the second guard moved to grab Kesha's shoulder, a sharp, melodic chime echoed through the lobby. Not the sound of the service elevator, but the private, golden bell of the executive lift. The doors slid open with a hiss of pneumatic grace. The air in the room suddenly grew cold, the gravity shifting toward the man who stepped out into the light. The struggle froze. The guard's hand stopped inches from Kesha's face. Preston's jaw dropped, his skeletal frame suddenly looking very small. The king had arrived, and the world of glass was about to shatter. The pneumatic hiss of the private elevator was a sound that commanded the very air to stop moving. In the Juno Tower, that chime didn't just signal a floor. It signaled a shift in the local gravity. As the gold-embossed doors slid open, the temperature in the lobby seemed to plummet, a cold, clinical stillness washing over the marble. Lee Juno stepped out. He didn't move with the frantic energy of the executives or the performative posture of the security guards. He moved with the terrifyingly calm grace of a man who owned every shadow in the building. His charcoal suit was a masterpiece of tailoring, but it was his presence, a heavy, suffocating aura of absolute authority, that made the group of corporate predators instinctively take a step back. For a second, Juno's eyes scanned the room, landing on the chaotic tableau in the center of his lobby. He saw the spilled tea, the dark amber stain spreading across the white marble. He saw the security guard's hand hovering inches from the face of a cleaner in a neon yellow vest. And then, he saw the frail man standing behind her, a man whose threadbare gray suit was soaked with oolong tea and whose shoulders were hunched in a posture of forced humility. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a pressurized void. "What?" Juno began, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried to the furthest corners of the vaulted ceiling. "Is happening in my house?" Preston, usually a man of sharp, cutting words, found his voice failing him. He scrambled forward, his skeletal frame trembling as he bowed so low his nose nearly touched the floor. "Mr. Lee. Sir, I am so sorry for this disruption. We were just disposing of a vagrant. This cleaner 402, she's had a breakdown. She's making impossible claims about this man to protect him from trespassing charges." Juno didn't look at Preston. He didn't even acknowledge the manager's existence. His gaze was fixed on the elderly man. The father looked up, his eyes meeting his son's. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply held up the small, weathered leather book, the family register that had been mocked by men who could barely remember their own grandfathers' names. Kesha, still bracing her mop handle like a barricade, felt the shift in the air. The black smoke of humiliation that had clung to the old man didn't just vanish. It was incinerated by the look of profound, agonizing shame that crossed Juno's face. The Mafia boss, a man whispered to be made of ice and iron, let out a breath that sounded like a wounded animal. "Father," Juno whispered. The word was a tectonic shift. Marcus, the executive who had spilled the tea, turned the color of ash, the porcelain cup slipping from his fingers and shattering against the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the stillness. Juno moved then, crossing the lobby in 3 long, predatory strides. He didn't go to the executives. He didn't go to Preston. He walked straight to the cleaner and the old man. The security guards scrambled backward, nearly tripping over their own feet to get out of his path. As Juno reached them, he did the one thing no one in the Juno Tower thought was possible. He ignored his own dignity. He dropped to one knee on the wet, tea-stained marble, ignoring the ruin of his expensive trousers. He took his father's trembling, calloused hands in his own. "Abyanim," Juno said, his voice thick with a vulnerability that made the executive shudder. "I am sorry. I have built a fortress so high that I failed to see the entrance." He looked up at Kesha then. For a long, heart-stopping moment, the boss and the cleaner shared a frequency. He saw the mop handle still gripped in her hands. He saw the defiance in her amber eyes and the neon vest that marked her as the help. He saw the only person in his entire empire who had been human enough to recognize his father. "You," Juno said, his voice regaining its lethal edge as he looked back toward the cowering staff. "You protected him." The king had descended, but he wasn't looking for a throne. He was looking for blood, and the world of glass was about to pay its debt. Juno remained on one knee for a moment longer, his forehead pressed against his father's calloused hand, a silent penance performed in front of the entire company. When he finally stood, the vulnerability vanished, replaced by a cold, radiating fury that seemed to darken the very air in the lobby. He didn't look at his father anymore. He looked at the world that had dared to humiliate him. His gaze first fell on Marcus. The executive was still frozen, his hands empty where the teacup had once been, his face a ghostly shade of gray. "You found his language offensive." Juno's voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a falling mountain. He stepped toward Marcus, who began to tremble so violently that his heels rattled against the marble. "You thought his clothes were a distraction to your profile? Mr. Lee." I didn't know," Marcus stammered, his voice cracking. "I thought he was just... I was trying to protect the company's image." "The company's image," Juno repeated, his eyes narrowing into lethal slits. "My father built the first warehouse of this empire with his bare hands while wearing those same clothes. He spoke that babbling dialect while he worked 18-hour shifts so I could one day afford the suit you are currently shivering in." Juno reached out, his fingers grazing the lapel of Marcus's expensive jacket. "You are fired. Not just from this firm but from this industry. By tomorrow morning, I will make sure your name is a curse in every boardroom from here to Seoul. Leave. Now." Marcus didn't argue. He turned and stumbled toward the revolving doors, his polished loafers slipping on the very tea he had spilled, fleeing the building like a whipped dog. Then Juno turned to Preston. The manager looked as though he wanted to dissolve into the floor. His skeletal frame was hunched, his hands twitching at his sides. He had spent years building a fortress of glass, where he was the supreme judge, only to realize he had been standing on a trapdoor the entire time. "Preston," Juno said. The name was a death knell. "Sir, I was only following protocol," Preston gasped, his eyes darting toward the security guards as if they could save him. The safety of the lobby. Protocol is for men who lack judgment, Juno interrupted, his voice cutting through Preston's excuses like a blade. You looked at a man who has lived 80 years of honor and saw filth. You looked at a woman who risked everything to do what was right and saw a liability. Juno stepped into Preston's personal space, his presence so overwhelming that the manager had to lean back against the concierge desk. You are the only filth I see in this lobby. You have 5 minutes to clear your desk. If you are still in this building after that, my security will show you exactly how we dispose of things that no longer have value. Preston's mouth worked silently, but no sound came out. He turned and fled toward the back offices, his dignity shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The remaining executives and guards stood paralyzed, waiting for the lightning to strike them next. But Juno's focus shifted. The coldness in his eyes didn't disappear, but it changed shape as he looked at Kesha. She was still standing there, her hands white-knuckled around the mop handle, her neon yellow vest a bright, defiant spark in the center of the wreckage. The hierarchy of the Juno Tower had been dismantled in a matter of seconds. The predators had been hunted, and the shadow had been revealed as the only person with a spine. Juno walked toward Kesha, stopping just a foot away. The power dynamic of the room had inverted. The man who owned the empire was now looking at the cleaner with a debt in his eyes that no amount of money could fully repay. You dropped your mop, Juno said softly, his voice finally losing its jagged edge. Kesha looked down at the plastic handle, then backed up at the boss. I didn't want him to be alone, she whispered. Juno nodded slowly, a look of profound, somber respect crossing his face. The glass walls of the tower were still standing, but for everyone watching, the world would never look the same again. The fortress had been breached, not by force, but by a girl who refused to be invisible. The heavy silence of the lobby was broken only by the distant, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock, a sound that seemed to count down the final seconds of the old regime. Juno stood tall, his hand still resting on his father's shoulder, a gesture that served as both a shield and a public declaration of love. He turned his gaze back to Kesha, who remained standing by her mop, her breathing finally slowing but her posture still anchored by the same defiance that had saved the man in the gray suit. What is your name? Juno asked. The question was quiet, but it carried a weight that made the remaining staff lean in. Kesha, sir, she replied, her voice steady. Juno looked at her employee badge, the plastic tag that Preston had used as a serial number. Kesha, you were willing to lose everything for a man you didn't know. You saw a father where these men saw a nuisance. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thin, black smartphone, tapping a few commands with clinical precision. I have just sent a message to my personal legal and financial team. Your grandmother's medical bills at the city hospital? They no longer exist. They were settled in full 30 seconds ago. And those student loans that have been a noose around your neck. I've bought the debt. Consider it a gift from a son who almost lost his foundation tonight. Kesha felt the air rush out of her lungs. The monument to poverty on her kitchen counter, the stacks of paper that had haunted her dreams, had been swept away by a single gesture from the man in the charcoal suit. She tried to speak, to offer some form of gratitude, but the relief was too vast, a tidal wave that drowned her words. Juno then turned his attention to the cowering group of executives and the guards who had participated in the humiliation. As for the rest of you, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly register, you will watch as Kesha is escorted from this building. Not as a cleaner, but as a guest of the Lee family. From this moment forward, she is under my personal protection. To disrespect her is to disrespect me. To ignore her is to ignore the law of this house. He signaled to a new group of men, his personal detail, who had just entered the lobby through the private garage. They moved with a silent, terrifying efficiency that made Preston's security team look like children playing at war. Take my father to the penthouse. Ensure he has the best tea in the city and a doctor to check his vitals, Juno commanded. He then looked at Kesha. "And take Kesha home. She has finished her shift. She will never have to pick up a mop in this building again, unless she chooses to own the company that makes them." As his team moved to fulfill his orders, Juno walked back to Preston, who was still slumped against the desk, his face a hollow mask of ruin. "I told you that you had 5 minutes, Preston. You've used 4. Juno didn't wait for a response. He turned and offered his arm to his father, the two of them walking toward the executive lift. Kesha stood in the center of the lobby, the neon yellow vest still bright against the marble. She watched them go, her heart no longer a trapped bird, but something soaring and free. The fortress of glass was still standing, but the cold, predatory spirit that had animated it was gone, replaced by the warmth of a debt finally recognized. As the private security detail stepped toward her to escort her to a waiting car, Kesha took one last look at the invisible world she was leaving behind. She wasn't a shadow anymore. She was a beacon, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the light. 3 years had passed since the glass walls of the Juno Tower had felt like a cage. For Kesha, the transformation of the building had been more than just a change in management. It was a shift in the very soul of the architecture. She no longer wore the neon yellow vest of the cleaning crew. Instead, she stood on the mezzanine level in a tailored suit of soft charcoal. Her posture relaxed but her eyes as sharp as they had ever been. She didn't look down at the floor to find her reflection anymore. She looked at the people. The lobby below was as grand as ever, the marble polished to a mirror shine, but the atmosphere had changed. The stifling pressure that once made the air feel thin had been replaced by a quiet, respectful hum. Juno had kept every promise. He had cleared the medical bills that once acted as a monument to her poverty, and he had given her grandmother 3 more years of life in a home filled with sunlight instead of shadows. But the greatest gift he had given Kesha was the authority to ensure that his father's story never repeated itself. Kesha watched from the balcony as the morning rush began. She saw the executives in their expensive wool, but she also saw the ghosts, the busboys, the maintenance crew, and the new cleaners. To the rest of the world, they were still background noise, but to her, they were the heartbeat of the empire. Below her, a young man in a stiff new uniform, a boy who looked no older than 19, was frantically scrubbing at a scuff mark near the elevators. His hands were trembling, his eyes darting toward the manager's desk with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. He dropped his spray bottle, the plastic clattering loudly against the marble. A senior vice president, a man who looked like a younger version of the predators Kesha once feared, stopped and looked down at the puddle of cleaning fluid on his shoes. He opened his mouth, his face beginning to redden with the familiar arrogance of power. Kesha didn't wait. She moved with a practiced grace, descending the stairs before the man could utter a single word of humiliation. "Is there a problem, Mr. Vance?" Kesha's voice was calm, but it carried the absolute weight of Juno's personal protection. The executive froze, his anger evaporating the moment he recognized her. He knew Kesha wasn't just a director of operations. She was the conscience of the Lee family. "No problem, Kesha. Just a minor accident." "Good," she said, her smile polite but firm. "I'm sure you have a meeting to get to. We'll take care of the floor." As the executive scurried away, Kesha turned to the young man. He was staring at her, his face a mask of shock and gratitude. She reached down, picked up his spray bottle, and handed it back to him. "It's just marble," she whispered, her voice warm and low. "And you're doing a fine job. Take a breath. No one in this building is invisible to me." The boy's shoulders slumped in relief, a small, genuine smile finally touching his lips. Kesha knew that look. She had carried it in her heart every day since the moment she dropped her mop to save a man in a gray suit. She looked toward the private elevators as the chime echoed through the lobby. Juno stepped out, followed by his father. The old man was dressed in a suit that fit him now, but he still carried the same weathered leather book in his pocket. He spotted Kesha and waved, a look of profound pride on his face. He had been the incognito king who started the fire, but Kesha was the one who had made sure it never went out. The cycle of cruelty had been broken. The Juno Tower was no longer a fortress of glass meant to keep the world out. It was a testament to the fact that in a city of wolves, there was finally a place where the angels were allowed to speak. Kesha stood in the center of the light, a guardian of the unheard, knowing that the invisible language was now the only one that mattered.